things and coding and engineering. But she's desperate to get into this school called Perfectus, which is sort of a streamline into this kind of career path that she wants to be in. But she just can't afford the Baku that she needs until she finds a broken one on the street, a broken cat Baku on the street. And she takes it back to her workshop, works on him, fixes him up, and he comes back to life. And little does she know that this Baku, who she calls Jinx, is just a little bit too real. There's just something a little bit too mischievous about him, but he is her ticket into this school, and together they learn that maybe not everything is right in the world of the technology that exists. So she's got a lot of exploring to do with the help of her friends.
Love it. Alex, a little bit about Curse of the Night Witch.
Sure. Curse of the Night Witch is the first book in the Emblem Island series, set on Emblem Island, a world where everyone is born with markings on their skin that represent their fate and their talents. So everyone has a lifeline that runs across their palm, and everyone has an emblem that's either a superpower or a role in society. So the main character, Tor Luna, hates his emblem. He is a born leader like his mother, who is chiefess of their village, but he does not want to lead anyone. So on the annual New Year's Eve celebration, where everyone has one wish that they can make in the hopes of it coming true in the new year, Tor wishes for a new emblem. But the next day, instead of his wish coming true, he wakes up and sees that he has been cursed and his lifeline has been shortened. So he and his two best friends must cross Emblem Island for the first time in search of the only person who can reverse that deadly curse. And in the process of trying to find this night witch, they will have to use an ancient book of legends, and they'll have to face the creatures, the monsters, the myths in those book of legends to find the night witch and break the curse.
Very cool. It's interesting hearing all these different stories, and I feel like hearing about Bakus and fairy tales. And I'm curious in terms of world building, how you go about it. I think it sounds like these are three really interesting stories that kind of push in different directions, but they all sound like they have pretty fascinating worlds that they're a part of. So I'd love to hear where you all drew inspiration from. Alex, maybe we start with you.
Sure. So the world of Emblem Island is really inspired by Colombian myths. So I'm half Colombian, and my grandma would always tell us cuentos before bed, which means stories. And my favorite one was about a girl with a star on her forehead, and she got the star because she did something good. She followed the rules, but then her sister did not follow the rules and she got horns instead. So just that concept of kind of earning a marking and having that marking have power kind of inspired, obviously, the emblems on Emblem Island. And then there are a lot of monsters and creatures in Emblem Island that are directly inspired by different Latinx myths like La Llorona, La Ciguapa. So I got a lot of inspiration from there, but then actually there's a second book in the series out now, and that one has its own mythology. So I took kind of like the root of the having emblems in that kind of world, and the second book is all about like sea myths and pirate myths and sirens and that kind of stuff. So that's where I got my inspiration. I think it was the kernel was from the Colombian myths I grew up hearing, and then it kind of just exploded. And I think when you start with something so creative and rich as like legends from a different culture, I think it really inspires you to grow from that. And it really inspired me to take it, I guess, to a new place in the second book.
That's awesome. I mean, no better place to draw than bedtime stories.
Yeah.
Amy, how about you?
Well, I was actually inspired by some of the school visits and readers kind of visits that I was doing at the time, because I was basically trying to think of a new book idea. I published, the Potion Diaries series, and that had gone really well, but I wasn't really sure where to go next with my next book. And I sort of thought back. So I was doing these school visits and kept encountering, these kids talking about the issues they were having with social media and their relationships with technology, and how different I was thinking their relationship with technology was to when I was in school, and how different my school experience might have been had I had access to that kind of technology. And also how so many of my friends' children and people I know have kind of grown up with technology in a very different way than I did. Especially, just carrying around such incredibly powerful computers in our pockets all the time. It's just sort of mind-blowing, even 15 years ago or whatever. And when I was in high school, I was also a really big science fair nerd. So I was really into engineering and science when I was a teenager. And I kind of combined all of that inspiration and tried to think, I wanted to write a book that teenage Amy would have loved. But I also wanted to think, what is technology going to be like for kids, for teens and middle schoolers, you know, in another 15 or 20 years, not even talking a long time in the future, but how is our technology going to evolve? You know, what is going to be the next version of a smartphone? So for me, I did a lot of research and actually came up with this really fascinating story about how electronic pets are actually being introduced into places like nursing homes or care homes, almost as a way of providing that kind of interaction and companionship that people sometimes struggle with, especially in the digital age, where, you know, so much of our communication happens through our technology, especially, you know, now in the pandemic where we communicate so much through our screens, but we kind of lack that interaction, that kind of companionship, and so a kind of a robotic pet, that's what sparked in me, that kind of combining connection, digital connection with companionship, and how that might be really interesting, and of course everyone could choose which animal they got, but also how it could be potentially really dangerous because you might not be so aware of the dangers of technology when it was so cute and cuddly.
I love that. God, I also love how you kind of flip on its head. I feel like so many writers talk about how difficult it is to introduce cell phones into a book. And it's like, no, you're just leaning all the way in. And
yeah, I just went full blown in, like, how can you, well, I think this is one of the things that middle schoolers and kids nowadays are dealing with all the time, is having to confront their relationship with technology, and also that technology is not necessarily, well, it isn't a bad thing, but it's how we, it's our relationship with it that's important. So technology is not going to go anywhere. We just have to learn to kind of live with it and deal with it.
Absolutely. Jen, I'd love to hear about your inspiration in world building. Oh, you're muted. You're saying amazing things. We can't hear you.
Sorry, Ben Kenobi is misbehaving, so I keep muting myself. As a kid, I just always loved fairy tales, but I was really fascinated with the villains. I always kind of wondered what makes a villain. And, to steal a line from the musical Wicked, are you born wicked, or is wickedness thrust upon you? Like, how does it really work? So the idea of creating a series around a bunch of former villains who are trying to be good and kids on the path to wickedness who are trying to behave felt like a really nice jumping off point, because I feel like villains sometimes have a skill set heroes don't, right? I mean, if anybody's going to take down another villain, it would be a potential villain because they know how their minds work. So that's kind of the fun of Fairy Tale Reform School, is that you get a group of kids who've been marked villainous as like the bad seeds in their group. And they come together and they try to become heroes in their own way, using their own unique skill set. And it's a lot about just not judging somebody by, their cover, like, so to speak. Each kid is really a work in progress through the whole series, especially the main character, Gilly, who is a pickpocket, who feels she's stealing for very valid reasons and has to learn how to change her approach to the fairy tale kingdom around her. So homes are boots and teacups and things like that. And I just kind of tried to have fun with all the fairy tale tropes and create a world that kind of pulled them all in, but put my own spin on it.
I love it. Actually, this leads perfectly into the next question, which is a little bit about research. And I love asking this question to authors of fiction, especially fantasy, because I think there's like I've seen in kind of my own experience that there's an assumption that, well, if you're writing adventure and fantasy, you're not doing any research. It's all kind of in your brain and imagination, but I find that not to be the case at all. So I'd love to hear a little bit. Amy, I know you dived into it a little bit already, but how all of you kind of research for your different books. Jen, let's start.
For me, it's really going back and reading like the Grimm's versions of fairy tales, Hans Christian Andersen, Charles Perrault, looking at, there are probably over 200 versions of Cinderella out there. So going back, looking at all those, pulling from all these different fairy tales in some way, shape, or form, and using them to create a new character. I do find sometimes when I do school visits, kids' only introduction to, say, Cinderella or the Evil Queen is the Disney version of the movie. And there are so many other versions out there. There's so many different ways the story could go. So just trying to pull from all the different versions and creating a new world is something I really like to do.
I'm jealous. I'm like a huge fairy tale nerd myself, so I'm jealous of.
We will have to talk.
Amy, how about you? I know you spoke a little bit about it already, but I'd be very curious to kind of hear a bit more.
Yeah, well, the thing about technology nowadays is that it is moving so fast that every time I thought like I was coming up with something new, I would be able to find someone who was out there actually doing it. But that was one of the amazing things that I came up with. Like I watched this incredible YouTube series about about this team of robot builders, all female, all girls robot builders, because there's like some huge tournaments where they get together and kind of battle. They were called the Iron Maidens, FE Maidens, which is like, just like my dream come true. I just absolutely loved it. But what I found really interesting was so many stories about robots, especially in film and TV, are focused on robots that look like us, so humanoid, walking on two legs. But actually, when you look at it from an engineering perspective, it's much easier to engineer something that's walking on four legs or something that's like more animal-like. So it's not too much of a leap to believe that robots that are in animal shapes could be sort of more common and could start to exist in our world more so than like your typical kind of android type robot. So I found that really fascinating. But yes, the speed of light at which technology is moving at the moment is incredible. But also that means there's almost limitless imagination for where I could take things, which was also so much fun.
Love that. Love that. Alex, how about you?
So my research was really just kind of calling my grandma. I'm lucky that I still have my grandma. And so I was just like, hey, can you tell me those stories again? And because the only like one-door story that was really vivid was the one about the girl with the star on her forehead. And so I at first, before I called her, I just started kind of typing words into Google, like in Spanish, like kind of tried it because I didn't even know the official name for the story. And I couldn't find anything. And so at first I was like, oh my gosh, did my grandma just make this up? And so I called her and she was like, oh yeah, it's called La Niña con la estrella en la frente, which means the girl with the star on her forehead. So I looked that up and found nothing. And so I kept digging and digging. And I finally found like some source of like some book that had been like put online from like the 70s of the exact same story my grandma told me. And I kind of like asked my family about it. And through my mom, I was able to piece together that a lot of these stories are told through like an oral tradition. And so they haven't really been put to paper and they change so much. So I was like, through more digging, I was able to find like a slightly different variations. And even like, Jen, what you were saying with like the Cinderella, I'm pretty sure that story is a kind of a take on a Cinderella because like the other sister is like an evil stepsister. And so it just was so wild to kind of try to do as much research as possible, but also know that a lot of stories that if you ask like people living in Colombia right now, they would know because they've heard just aren't really like published yet. So it was kind of like a big responsibility I put on myself of like, okay, if I'm going to be one of the first people to like, put these stories like in a fantasy book, like I kind of what it was a lot of the research was researching the stories, but then seeing how I could not only do them justice, but also change them to fit within the world of Emblem Island. Like La Llorona is such a vivid tale that it has been like put into like movies and a lot of different media. But I had to fit that into the world where like people had emblems. So in my version, like she has an emblem and that kind of has to do with the story. And so my research was really I bought so many different books of legends from like Latinx myths and I read them all. But at the end of the day, like a lot of the ones I used were like purely from the oral tradition. So I'm actually like really looking forward to like once the world opens up, like going back to Colombia and like talking to people and like kind of trying to dig and see because it's just such a different thing. I mean, in America, I haven't seen that there are stories that people pass along that you wouldn't have heard of or wouldn't be able to buy a book about. So that was my main research. And I was definitely really shocked, like, because I mean, I grew up with the internet, like I'm used to being able to type something in and find an answer, at least go to the library, but that just wasn't the case.
Wow, I have the exact same experience, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I was studying Puerto Rican myths for mine, and I couldn't find anything on them. And same thing, like how does everything exist online right now? And
Yeah.
I guess I'm curious, kind of to ask all three of you, what are the essential elements to a fun adventure story, and how do those elements kind of appear within your books? Let's see. Let's start with Amy.
Well, I like a good animal companion in my adventure stories, as you can tell from Jinxed. I always think, you see that in a lot of fairy tale stories as well. I mean, obviously, every Disney fairy tale story has that kind of animal companion or the kind of devil and angel on the shoulder type thing accompanying. So I found that really, really fun to play with. But I think also just having like a really kind of compelling main character who's out there looking for answers, who's never kind of, even Lacey, my main character, she's very smart and she's very focused on what she wants to do, but you kind of have to push your main characters out of their comfort zones in order to get them into those situations that they find kind of adventurous and thrilling. So that's what I was always trying to do all the time. I sort of sent her a really mischievous animal companion to kind of really push her out of her comfort zone, force her to make new friends, force her into different situations, and that really kind of opened up her world. And then also set the stage, of course, for Jinxed, and then the second book, Unleash, as well, where Lacey has to go even deeper into the kind of corporate, the shadowy corporate technology world, to kind of figure out the mystery of what's happening with these Bakus. So yeah, I think pushing your character out of their comfort zone is one of the keys.
Agreed. Jen?
Yeah, Amy, I think that's so true. Pushing them out of their comfort zone, right? I mean, what does your character most want? And how can you make sure you don't let them have it right away? Because that doesn't make for a very exciting story. You know, we want to see how everything ends, but if it's an easy road, it's not that exciting. So I love the characters with flaws. I love the characters who, just are a little bit unique, a little bit different. You know, what's, something about your character you haven't read about in 1,000 other books. And, for Gilly is, very jaded when we meet her. As I said, she's a pickpocket. She's sarcastic. She really cannot stand royals. And then she quickly learns in Flunked that somebody might secretly be royal that she's very close with. So it kind of turns her whole world on its head. So I love that. I love when you can trick the reader a little bit, like maybe not give all your information right away, and just take them on a really good journey.
Love that. I feel like I should be taking notes if I wasn't moderating. Alex?
Exactly what Jen and Amy said. I think like whatever your character wants, put obstacles in their path. And that was really important for my books because both the first and the second book are quest narratives. So it's kind of just like almost like the Dora Explorer, like how it's like, where's the map? And then the 3 different things, but you have like 20 different things before they reach the end, or like what they think is the end. And I think for me, just, it was always so fun to try to put things in their path that get like, I don't know, like more fantastical. And you kind of just have to top yourself, because I never wanted the reader to get bored, and we're writing for children at the end of the day, and they do get bored so quickly. And so I think it's such a great opportunity to have the pacing be really fast, and you don't really have time for the slow moments, because once it gets slow, like, oh, everything seems like it's great. You have to like throw in something to make a twist. And so I love writing these quests, because whether it's through Emblem Island, like the first book, or Across the Seas for the second book, there are always these different obstacles in their path, and also obstacles within their relationship. So the 3 main characters, Tor, Melda, and Engel, they're friends, but there are certain things that like you kind of sprinkle through that sometimes the worst problems happen within the friend group and with the people who are closest to you on the journey, and who can you trust and what's going to happen next. So I think just leaving a lot of uncertainty, but always keeping the pace like so quick, because I feel like kids really are very honest, and they will put a book down if they don't like it. So I think it's always a challenge, and also such an amazing experience to try to top yourself, to try to make the environment so fantastical and so amazing that the main characters don't know what to do, and they really have to search within themselves and grow in order to get to the end of their journey.
Agreed. Yeah, it's interesting. I definitely find it very a good challenge to be that focused in every chapter. I love it. We actually have a question from somebody in the chat. So question from Natalie, which follows pretty well with everyone was talking about. Which one of your characters is your favorite? Jen?
I have a character named Maxine. She's an ogre. She is pretty much the only ogre at Fairy Tale Reform School. She drools a lot. She's very clumsy. She's got very big feet. She has one eyeball that rolls around in its socket when she's lying. But I always like to call her my Neville Longbottom. Like, you can't count her out. She will always do the right thing in the end. And she is really there for all the other characters. So she's probably my favorite to write.
I love it. Alex?
I think my main favorite character is Melda. I have a lot of favorite characters that are kind of side characters, but Melda is the most like me. She is also a born leader like Tor, but the difference is she loves her emblem and she feels like she deserves a lot more than she gets, and she's really fighting for, and she's really ambitious. And so I really kind of relate to her. And I think my favorite side character is a character from the second book. Her name is Violet, and she's an assassin, but a good assassin. And there's just such a culture around like the assassins in her group and the type of assassin she is. And she's a little bit older than the main characters. And I just love her so much. I could write like a whole series about her. And she just was a surprise favorite that I put in there. And she wasn't 100% important to the story, but I really fought to keep her in there because I love her so much.
That's awesome. Amy, I hope it's a robot animal.
It is, yeah, it is. Definitely Jinx was my favorite character to write. He was so funny and sarcastic and just allowed me to kind of play so much more in that kind of humorous space, which I absolutely love to do. But also, don't tell Jinx, but I'm not really a cat person. I'm more of a dog person. I have a dog. His name is Moose. He's a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, and he's so cute and lovely. But I had the experience of looking after my friend's cat for 3 months while she went away. And we had a very sort of cautious relationship. This cat sort of didn't know what to make of me. I didn't know what to make of her. And then by the end of it, we were so close. We were best friends. She would come up and like rub her head against me. So she converted me, and all of that love sort of I poured into Jinx as well. But cats, they test you. And I quite loved exploring that in fiction.
100%. Love it. So I have another good question from one of our audience members, which I think would be really interesting to ask all of you. What made you start writing? Let's start, Alex.
Sure. So I started writing when I was 12. I was a huge reader, I'm sure like all of us. I loved to read so much. Every summer vacation, I would have like a big pile of books next to my bed that as soon as I would finish, I would put on the pile, and it would be like this big, just like a few weeks into summer. I loved escaping into different worlds. And I think I kind of remember a vivid experience. Like I was driving, I think for like a field trip or something. I was like on a bus and I was listening to music and looking out the window, and I just had like a vivid like scene come to me. And so I was like, oh, I guess I'll write a book. And I started writing my first book when I was 12, and I started trying to become an author when I was like 12 or 13, like sending query letters. So it happened really early. And I don't know, I don't remember a time when I didn't want to be an author. Even when I was younger, like I was the kid that was folding like paper and like pretending to write a book and like drawing the little drawings and writing in the margins and everything. It was just a dream that I've had like so vividly for so long. Like everyone in my family and my friends knew that that's what I wanted to do. And it took many years like past that point to actually like get an agent and get a book deal and everything. But it's just what I wanted to do my entire life.
Yeah, amen, agreed. Amy, did you have a specific moment like that? How did you kind of come about?
Well, actually, Alex, it's interesting what you said. I actually wasn't a big reader when I was a kid. In fact, my parents really had to try and coax me into reading. What they did, they kind of tricked me because they started reading Nancy Drew books to me when I was a little bit old, maybe 8 or 9, maybe a little bit older than that. And they would only read me kind of 1 or 2 chapters at a time. And the Nancy Drew books are so clever because each chapter ends on a cliffhanger. So it's like Nancy and her friends are just about to discover something, and then you don't find out. So eventually I got so tired of having to wait overnight to figure out what happens to Nancy. I realized, stupid Amy, I could just pick up the book and read it and finish it and find out. And I honestly, after that, it was like unstoppable. You could not stop me from reading. But I didn't actually think about writing until, I guess, Alex, it's sort of kind of a similar story to how you said you were inspired to write Curse of the Night Witch, because it was wanting to find, I'm half Chinese, and it was wanting to find fantasy stories that were kind of set in a culture that meant something to me and that I had listened to my mother and grandmother talk about, and again that I didn't really I was a huge fantasy nerd, but I wasn't really finding those kinds of stories on the bookshelves and the ones that I wanted to read. So The Oathbreaker Shadow, which was my first book, was sort of inspired by those stories. And I realized the only way I was going to get to read that was to write it. So I was like, oh, I'm going to have to do it myself then, I guess. And yeah, from then on, just fell in love with writing, and so lucky to be, 10 books in now.
10 books in, congratulations. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Jen, I'd love to hear. Was there a moment? Did you get tricked into writing like Amy?
I feel bad saying this, Alex. I was a reluctant reader too. I know, Alex, you read from like the very beginning. I was like Amy in that I loved being read to. I didn't like reading on my own. And my teacher one day noticed this, and she said, maybe you should stop reading what everybody else is reading and think about the kind of things you would actually enjoy. So we talked about the things I was interested in. I loved dance. I loved fairy tales. I loved funny movies. And she gave me a Judy Blume book, Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing. And it kind of changed everything. Like all of a sudden I realized, wow, there are books I really enjoy. And then by fourth grade, my mom has this paper that I always show on school Zooms where we had to write about what we would ask for if a genie gave us 3 wishes. And my third wish was to be an author for young readers. So I guess then I became Alex, and I just started writing my own stories. I loved writing about my friends. I would say, what do you want me to write about? And they would say, a scenario, and then I would write these short stories for them. So I'm lucky I didn't get in trouble because it was always notes being passed in class, but that's how I started, with notes.
Well,
short
in
stories.
my yearbook, I was voted most likely to become an author, so I must have been on a like a path that other people could see that I wasn't quite there yet. So.
I love it. Now, I think it's time to get a little bit into process because I love nerding out about process. So do any of you have any unique, quirky writing habits that you do? The quirkier and more unique, the better, I guess. Amy.
Well, I actually have worked really hard on not being too prescriptive about how and when and where I write. So, I feel like the amazing things about being a writer is that you can literally do it anywhere. So I have trained myself. I write, wherever I have a spare moment, whether that's in the before times in an airport waiting lounge, I would do a lot of writing there. If I have, 10 minutes before a movie at a coffee shop, you will find me somewhere writing, and I will write on napkins if I've forgotten a notebook or anything. I can just slip into that kind of writing headspace. I try not to need a special candle lit or need a particular chair or something. I really like to really get out into the world and kind of take inspiration from anywhere and be able to kind of write those ideas down when they come into my head. And the most interesting or different place I'd say I've ever written a book is 8,000 meters above sea level in the death zone on the world's 8th highest mountain. I sat down and wrote a paragraph wearing oxygen and everything. I took out my notebook and a Sharpie and started writing.
Did you look at it later and say, this is genius, or I was clearly...
the words just start slipping off the page like that in the middle of the death zone. But so I write anywhere.
I am so jealous. I wish I could. I don't need a candle, but I wish I could write in an airport. That would be next level for me. Jen, how about you?
Okay. Amy, I have to ask though, do you write on your phone since you're so much about technology? Do you ever take your phone out and do a Google Note or something?
Oh, I do. I have notes, so many notes going down the page. Some of my best lines, I think I've written on my iPhone. So there you go.
There you go. I'm kind of old school in that I start my plotting process on Post-it notes. I love Post-it notes because I had seen some documentary or show about TV writers and how they sit around a writer's room and they plot everything out on a whiteboard and use Post-it notes or things they can move around. And I was like, I love that process. So I started doing it a while ago, and I find it really helps me to see the story visually at first, even if it's just a simple note, dragon attacks school. Just to stick all these Post-it notes on a board and then keep staring at them until a story starts to take shape. And I think of every book like a puzzle that has to be solved. You know how with a puzzle, you always know, usually the straight edge pieces, I call that the beginning and the end of the book. I usually know that. The middle, like the middle of a jigsaw puzzle, is very murky. So I take all those notes and I keep moving them around and around, figure out what's still missing, until story starts to take shape. Then I move to my computer and I will do a heavier outline. I'm definitely an outliner than a pantser. I have to have an outline, but I start with the Post-it notes.
I feel like that's such an interesting point to make too, because I think I had a similar thing where I always thought I hated puzzles growing up. And then when I started writing books, I figured the same thing out. I was like, this really feels a lot like a puzzle, and I really enjoy this kind of puzzle. So I think that's really important for aspiring writers out there. A lot of times I do think it's really fun kind of puzzle craft, what you're really doing.
It's a fun process because you're like, oh, I didn't think of that. And you kind of figure out what fits where and what might still be missing and what you could stick in, if you have a hole in the story. I enjoy it just looking at it because I think we're all creative types. And for me, being visual definitely helps kick off the process. Yeah,
agreed. Alex?
I think I've always been like this in school. Like I always did well, but I wasn't necessarily like a procrastinator because I was always working on something, but I would always get my best work done like at the last minute. And so for the Emblem Island books, I like have written them both in a very short amount of time, but like not sleeping, which is like not recommended, but literally like I get my best work done. And I feel like just aesthetically, like I love like kind of like making a coffee at 10 p.m. being like, let's do this, or like getting up at 5 a.m., which sounds like nuts, but I just get my best work done when like everyone's sleeping and like I feel like I'm the only one up and I'm working. I don't know what about that is inspiring to me, but even just knowing I'm a month until deadline and like working on a book, maybe it's because I have no excuses. Like I can't just say, oh, I have weeks or months, I can just stop. And so I have to keep going. And so my process so far for every book has been, I'll take the time to read and watch movies and kind of get inspired by everything and write little notes on my phone. But then by the time I have to sit and when I write my first page, I'm like in it. I can just write without stopping. And luckily, because I've taken such a long time, I guess, to like be in my own mind, by the time I sit down, what I write is almost exactly what gets published. Like obviously I go through edits, but it really, I don't have the process of I'll read or write an entire book and then delete it. Like I write the entire book and like, luckily it's pretty close to what it ends up being, but it's not any shorter. It's just the whole process together takes a really long time, but me actually sitting at the computer and writing doesn't. And I recently, because of the pandemic, I used to like have really good like workspaces and be able to be alone, but because I was either with family or like in my small apartment, I didn't necessarily have quiet. And so I started listening to music while I wrote, and I never thought I would be able to do that because I can't focus on like multiple things, but it really has helped me even just to listen to the same song for hours, which seems really annoying, but the words kind of fade away and it's able to like just keep me on track and keep me in the world that I'm writing. And so I think I'm also just still discovering, and I love that you said that you saw something from a documentary, because I'm always kind of like taking notes in the back of my mind of like how other creatives are doing things. And I love Victor, like when people ask this too, because I like to kind of like note like, oh, they do this, because I still think I've written like 4 books now that are actually being published, and I still feel like I'm not like the teacher, but I'm on the other side. Like I'm the student and still learning what works for me. I've recently started doing outlines. I hated doing outlines. I would just write a bunch of scenes, but then I would waste so much time because then you try to put them together and you're like, Alex, this is not working. And so it's way better for me to just start with a few scenes to like kind of get inspired and then maybe fit them in, but then have a full outline. And I think like, I mean, Amy, with 10 books, like I'm sure it's, once it becomes a job and you have contracts and like you have deadlines and stuff, it feels almost impossible not to be able to do that with an outline.
Yeah, I feel like there's 2 really interesting things there, because I think one, like you said, like I love hearing other people's process, because I have found so far that everyone's is either a little or like completely different.
Yeah.
But the other one I think is important, if anyone else here also is kind of an aspiring writer, is I do think that for a lot of writers, it changes a lot. Like mine changed too. I was the same thing. I actually, I think I would have been a writer 10 years earlier if I didn't think that I was an outliner. You know, I'm a pantser. Like I just have to write a bunch of stuff and then go back. And I think a lot of people try to figure out where they are on that that timeline. And last thing, which I think is really funny, I feel like the intensity with which you kind of attack your project sounds very similar to Gabriel Garcia Marquez has like a very similar process where he would like do it all in one, smoke 1,000 cigarettes, drink a ton of coffee, and like.
My vices are banana bread. I always, whenever I have a deadline, I'm like, gotta make the banana bread. And I feel like some sort of pleasure, like getting the corner piece, and like having my espresso at like 5 a.m. being like, let's do this. So I definitely have my own little things, or like gummy bears, or like some sort of thing that like gets me through that time.
But do you guys find, like, as much as I'm an outliner, I find like the week of deadline, usually like the last day before I have to turn a book in, I'll be like cleaning the house, I'm mopping floors, and my husband will be like, what are you doing? Isn't your book due today? And I like just can't finish it. I have to do something else. And I'm on book 30. And that has never changed. That is the one thing that has stayed consistent. If they catch me like cleaning a bathroom mirror, it's probably deadline week. Like, I don't know what happens. I'm just a little afraid to finally put the book aside. And I think that's because we're never really done, right? I mean, if I've done, you know, pre-pandemic, when you do book signing somewhere in person, I would find myself crossing out lines in a book and editing my book before I read it. And a bookseller looked at me once, she's like, what are you doing? And I'm like, well, it's never really done. You always want to make an improvement. So.
Oh my gosh, Jen, 30 books. Like, I feel like I really want to hear all of your secrets.
It's a work in progress, like everybody else.
I think that point was one of the things that took me a while to get used to as well. The idea of like, it doesn't feel done ever. Like, you know, you're just waiting for the next round of edits. Like, oh, it's in the world now. I can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
Alex, you mentioned this, and I'd be curious to hear from Amy and Jen in terms of how has the pandemic changed your writing process, your routines, how you do it, how you're forced to do it differently. How has it changed it? Amy?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I used to try and get out into the world as much as I can to write, and I haven't been able to do that at all. You know, just been stuck in my apartment as well. And my new addition, my lockdown addition was my dog. So that was an interesting, raising a puppy at the same time as trying to write 2 books. Suddenly became a very interesting experience, but actually I wouldn't, you know, he's become such an amazing companion now, and wouldn't change that for the world. But yeah, it's been different. I also co-wrote a novel during the pandemic. So I had a co-author, and that was really tricky because for all of the planning of the book, we'd been able to meet up and like bounce ideas off each other, and all of a sudden we were forced to stay apart, and we had to really change that process. So it became a lot more like WhatsApp voice notes, or like trying to catch each other on Zoom or FaceTime, which is a little different, I would say, from kind of vibing off each other in person. So that became a little bit more challenging, but also I guess you just had to adapt, didn't you? You just had to get it done. And one of the amazing things about the pandemic has been, you know, the huge like, you know, resurgence of technology, which means that, you know, even though I'm over here in England, I can come and join more events. And I've been doing school events in the US and in Canada, as well as here, all virtually. And that's been kind of amazing to see people still embracing books and reading in this time. You know, that's never really dropped off. And it kind of shows you what becomes important. You know, the pandemic really helps put your priorities in place. And, you know, it's really gratifying as an author to know that reading kind of hasn't dropped off that list, that finding that entertainment, you know, that getting lost in worlds is still so important, and is kind of a lifeline for so many people. So that's been a real kind of bonus of the pandemic, I guess, you know, having this connection and knowing that people still love reading.
Great call. Yeah, definitely a lifeline. And honestly, I think, you know, in terms of being glad that people are reading, I remember when it started and people were finding it very difficult to read, and it's nice that we all kind of pushed past that societally. Yeah.
It's
Jen?
so helpful to get lost in other worlds. I feel like we, you know, like you said, once we got past that, I felt like we were ordering books like crazy. But I've been writing from home for 16 years. I've been the only one home for 16 years. And then we locked down, and it was my husband working from home, my teen and my tween working from home. All of a sudden everybody was like, "Can I use your Mac?" And I'm like, "I'm writing," and I lost my office, and there was like no quiet space in the house. And as you can see, Ben Kenobi keeps Zoom bombing. He has loved being part of school visit Zooms this year. I don't know how he knows I'm on, but he always knows. And that was really hard because I liked writing during the day, during like school hours. That was, I think Alex is right. Like early before everybody has been a lifesaver for me since the pandemic started. Like just, finding some quiet time and space. I've had to just really adjust my schedule to make it work. And I also feel like Alex, I had to start, listening to music when I wrote, because there were so many people home and there were so many other distractions that weren't there before. But, life does go on. And I was so thankful to have the writing and have the last book in the Royal Academy Rebel series to work on and escape into that world. But finding my own space to do it was definitely the difficult part. So like Alex said, like for me, I can't stay up late and write, Alex. I'm so jealous. But like I would rather get up at like 5 and have a few quiet hours before everybody appears. And that has helped.
Me too, for sure. And it's funny you say that, because I think it's really the idea that like you had a story in a world you could jump into kind of as a separate, that was huge for me as well. And I'd imagine. I'm getting a lot of really interesting questions from our audience. So I'm going to jump into some of these. One from Elliot and Zoe that sounds great. So do any of you ever feel like you're accidentally copying from other stories?
I've done it. When I started working on the fairy tale reform school books, I remember I had like 1 or 2 ideas, and my editor was like, "Ooh, that's a little close to like something that would happen in like Hogwarts." And I'm like, oh, you're right. I think, you want to create, it's like that. So like, I don't know, double-edged sword. At first, like having like something like Harry Potter out there made me scared to create my own school, for kids that was in the adventure fantasy realm. And then I thought, well, that was totally created out of nothing. Why can't I do it as well? So you just, keep your details different. And, my school is very different from Hogwarts, but, sometimes I get a little bit scared. So I watch like I have moving hallways at Fairy Tale Reform School, so nobody knows their way around. You don't want anybody to know their way around because it's a reform school and people might escape. But I got rid of the moving staircases and things like that because my editor was like, "Ooh, don't they do that in one of the Harry Potters?" And I'm like, "Oh, they do." But, you're constantly trying to come up with new ways to reinvent the wheel.
100%. Amy?
But it's funny, I feel like you could give, me, Alex, and Jen 1 line of a story idea. And if you asked us each to write that book, and you, Victor, sorry, of course, and then we would all come up with a totally different story. So sometimes I do read the synopsis of something that might be like, and then her robot animal companion, I'm like, it's Jinxed, but actually it's completely different. And I really feel like that's important. Like, yes, of course, there are wizarding schools, but there are so many, there are so many variants on the wizarding school. And of course, Hogwarts is far from the first wizarding school, you can go back long, long way to find that. So I think it's important to not be, obviously you don't want to be creating just like a direct copy of something, but I think it's also important not to be afraid, to pursue your own ideas if it just happens to be somewhat similar. I think that we're all bringing our own kind of, our own cultural backgrounds, our own influences to each story, and yeah, very rarely do I ever see anything that's like too close.
It's a great point, and also I feel like a nice to settle everyone, because I feel like a lot of people freak out about that when they're writing a book. So it's great to mention it. Alex?
Yes, so Amy, it's so funny that you say that, because when Curse of the Night Witch was coming out, there was an announcement for a book that sounded exactly like mine, like down to the like Latin American legends in a book, and I was like, oh my gosh, what? And then I've read the book and it could not be more different. And so it just, I see a lot of people like comment and I know a lot of people have asked me like, oh, this sounds exactly like the book I'm writing. It's like, I promise it's not. Also, I wouldn't be afraid of doing that because I know like the first book I wrote when I was 12 was like basically a ripoff of like my favorite book at the time, but that's how you learn. Like, obviously that was never going to get published. And so like, I think the best way to learn honestly is to like emulate something you really admire, because then you learn about story structure, you learn about like character development, and obviously you're not going to get that published because that would be bad. Like, you are like kind of copying. But I think like as authors in any sort of creative, like what we create is just kind of like an amalgamation of like everything we've ever read, everything we've ever seen, everything we've ever done. And that's how it's been like from the beginning of time. Like we're just building off of all of our own experiences. And so I don't know. It's also really interesting because I posted something about like Emblem Island and about the concept, and I had so many people commenting like, oh, this is like My Little Pony, and I've never seen My Little Pony. I was just not my age. Like I think I was too old. Like I didn't even know they had a TV series. So I can like 100% say like I've never watched it. I don't know. Apparently they have like cutie marks or something that's are like emblems. And so something like that, like, I mean, there are only, I guess, so many ideas in the world. Like I didn't invent symbols like on skins or like symbols that like have powers. And so I think like it's silly to get wrapped up in it, because like as a creator, what you ultimately are going to put out is like your millionth idea. It's not the first thing that you've come up with that might be a little bit derivative. And even if your first idea is a little bit derivative, like it's the whole entire point is to make it different and just kind of constantly be reworking it. And sometimes like, I mean, it's just human nature to be inspired by everything that's around you. And so I would caution like any young writers or anyone who like wants to start writing, like don't get so worked up on that, because your idea will find its original place. Because it's not like we all come up with an idea and we write the book the next day. I'll come up with an idea and I might not write the book for years, because that's the time it takes to really make it original and really like kind of peel back the layers of, oh, this kind of seems derivative and all of this stuff. And so I just think that's not really a worry of mine. And like to worry about that is just is just not productive, because at the end of the day, it seems like there are trends that we don't even know about, that like a million books will publish in 1 year about the same topic, and like no one knew about it. It's not like everyone was doing it at the same time, but it just might be little things like a story on the news leads to a TV show that someone read that article, and it's kind of like a joint consciousness, but everything's always so different. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. Like obviously no one who's publishing a book and like has gone through all those steps is going to publish something that's like identical to something on purpose. So it's just not like, don't worry about it.
Such a good point. And you know, speaking to kind of like author anxiety questions, here's a good one from Ram. Have you ever finished a book and then looked over it and you hate it?
Every first draft. Every first draft. It's normal. I mean, but you know, the first draft is your throwaway draft, right? I mean, then you have to, I don't know about you guys, you may love first drafts. I hate first drafts with a burning passion. Find it so hard to get the story out of my head or off the Post-it notes onto the computer. I am so much happier doing the work and revising. I actually really look forward to that edit letter, so I can see like, oh, you're right, I've missed this, or there's a plot hole here, or if I pulled out this character more, maybe the story would completely turn. I love revising and making the story better. No one should think any author out there writes a book, hands it to their publisher, and they're like, yes, we're going to go off and print this. We have several drafts. We have amazing editors who help us with our work, copy editors. It takes a village to create a book, and I'm so thankful for it.
I think it's really worth it to make that specific point that you're making in terms of liking revisions. I was always scared of revising. So I was always like, I'm just going to write one draft and maybe terrified to go back. But you're right. Over time, like I don't like the first draft as much as I like the revisions, which is such a strange thing to think about. Amy, how about you?
Yeah, I'm kind of the same in that I love the revision process as well, except when it gets to like really close to the end and I feel like I've read the book so many times, but like the words don't even make sense to me anymore. And that's when I kind of, also when I start drifting off into another story as I'm reading, or like I really want to be writing something else now, I know it's kind of like time for me to like let it go, send it off. That's the only time I really sort of like I'm kind of done with my book. But and then I fall back in love with it by the time it comes out with a beautiful cover and everything. I'm like, oh yeah, I wrote this. Because often that's a few months down the line from kind of reading the final version. I've never really written anything and then really hated it, because you invest so much in the process that even if I know this book, I've written a couple of books, especially in the early stages of my process, that will just never see the light of day. And that's absolutely fine. I definitely don't hate them, but I know they're not publishable. But they hold like a special place in my heart, because like Alex said, they taught me something about how to write. You know, I learned something about myself or a character, and they were all like forming part of the, you know how there's that whole Stephen King thing saying you have to write 1,000,000 words or whatever. That's all part of that process of writing and learning my craft. So no, I've never written anything and been like, you know, wanted to set it on fire or anything.
Thank goodness. And in terms of another interesting one, this one from Ethan, what kind of mindset do you have when you're in the middle of writing a book? So do you ever worry about what your readers are going to think about the book? Do their opinions matter to you? Do they slow you down? How does that kind of fit into your process? Let's see. Januela, you're nodding the most. So I'll start with you.
Me? You know, it depends. I mean, we all work on series, all of us here. And you know, I definitely take note of what the fans are looking for and want, but you also have to be careful to protect your world and protect your characters. I don't necessarily, I read all my emails. I don't read reviews, because I've done that before in the past, where I've read like reviews and it's kind of affected me in a way where I feel like I can't create after that. Like I'm so in the mindset of like a review that I'm like, oh God, do I do this? Is this how I write? That I can't go on. So I love when they send emails, and I love when they want to see more of a character, but I definitely steer clear of reviews.
It's a great call. Alex, how about you?
I think especially like, I only have 2 books out now, and I had to finish the second book before the first book came out. So I haven't had that experience. And even now, like with the like potential of writing a third book, like I don't know that it would. I think I'm similar to Jen, and I'm gonna like learn from what Jen just said, that I think like as an author, you really do have a clear picture of like how the next book would go and what would actually happen and what would be like true to your characters versus like, and I think that can kind of be different. What is like good for your world and your story versus like what would feed like fans, I guess, like what they want. And I mean, I do that too, like for TV shows or works, like I like love some parts so much, but I know in the back of my mind, it's not good for the series to go in that direction, or it doesn't make sense for the character to do that. And so I haven't luckily had that experience. I think like for the question, like the middle of the book is more like an anxiety because the middle is so hard to write versus like kind of caring about what everyone else is saying. Because the middle is just so, I mean, with the quest, it's easier because like the middle is just kind of the middle of their journey. Like you'll throw in something different, but there's always somewhere else to go. I think in a typical like narrative that isn't a quest, the middle is so hard because you don't want to have a sagging middle. The middle is the point where you either kind of like makes or breaks a story. And so I think that's definitely the hardest part for me, because at the beginning, I have so much adrenaline and so much excitement over the idea. And so it's like gets you like, oh, this is so cool. And then you write it and then you get to the middle, and that's kind of the part where it starts fizzing out. And you're like, I know the ending, but like, how do I get there? And so then that's definitely the hardest part in general. But yeah, I also don't read reviews. Like obviously like the like the Kirkus and like those types of reviews, like you can't really like not read them. But in terms of like readers, I mean, it's, I don't know, like it seems like a little bit like I don't want to ignore what readers are saying, but at the same time, like our job is to create. And as Jen said, like if anything stops you from creating, that's not a good thing. Like, so yeah, I think it's controlling and like protecting your process and your creativity is my number one priority. So also I'm going to learn from Jen from what she said, because she has a lot more experience than I do.
No review sites. Don't review.
Yeah.
I've got to get better about that. Amy, how about you?
Yeah, I think the only time I think about what the reader is going to think is when I'm writing something like Jinxed, which is kind of set in our world, but using future technology, I really try and make sure that I've done, as much kind of research or tried to find contacts of people to talk to make sure I'm kind of delivering something that will feel authentic to the reader in the future, who might have, more knowledge about that kind of technology than I do, and try and, obviously as an author, you're not an expert in every topic, but that's really the only time I think about or worry about how a reader is going to react if I've written something that's totally implausible and then someone's going to come after me and, afterwards and just say that could never happen. But in terms of reader reviews and things, I'm with you guys. I try not to read, and I just try and deliver what I feel like my characters want, and hopefully readers respond from that point.
Love it. Sadly, I know we're running a little bit out of time, so if I haven't asked your question, they're all actually great, so I apologize. There's one from Cassandra that I think would be a good closing one, which is, what advice would you give to young writers? Amy, let's start with you.
Well, I have two pieces of advice which I always give. One of them is read, read widely, read, the kind of thing you want to write, but also read outside your genre. Like Jen said, if you haven't found the kind of book that you love, I guarantee you there's something out there that will appeal to you. Otherwise, my advice is persevere. Writing is definitely a long game, and don't give up. Even if your first story isn't quite there, so many of us authors have those books that we started out writing that are trunk novels. You put under the bed and you forget about it, but that is all so crucial to that process. Even if no one else sees it, that's you learning and growing as a writer. And you're going to face a lot of rejection in a career as a writer. So learning how to persevere is really important. Don't give up.
Amen. Jen?
Finish your work. I think, there's always a new, shiny, exciting idea out there. I think all of us, we're in the middle of revisions or our first draft. We're thinking of that shiny new idea that seems so much easier and better. But you have to prove to yourself that you can finish a story. So I don't care if it's a paragraph, a page, 10 pages, or 100. Finish the story. Find a way to finish it and prove that you can do it, because then you get to go in and do the revising, or then you move on to the new shiny idea. That idea is not working, but prove you can finish it.
Such a good one. Alex?
I would say be patient. I think when you're young, like you expect and you want things to happen so quickly, and you think that you're constantly running out of time. I know when I was 12, like I did start to query, and I did start to try to get published, and it didn't happen for like 10 years. So it would have been way better if I just been patient and had sat with a single manuscript or just a few and really tried to edit it, instead of just trying to like write to trend or just trying to be in a constant rush to get published. I think like what Amy said, like honestly, the first 1,000,000 words or more is just practice. And that's fine, because this is a long game, like Amy said. And if you want to be in this industry and make a career out of it, it's not a fast industry. It's not like if you finish your book tomorrow, it's going to come out in a week. It's going to come out, even if you get a book deal tomorrow, in 2 years. And so just kind of knowing that, and knowing that you're going to save so much time by being patient and by taking critique. And that's so hard when you're young. You think either you're the best and, oh my gosh, no one's ever written a book like me, or you think I'm the worst, I don't want anyone to read this, and any sort of criticism just kind of crumbles you. I think any sort of feedback is a gift. Honestly, even if it's an agent rejecting you, but if they give you comments, like that is a gift, because in this industry, no one owes you anything. No one gets paid until you sell a book. And so if you get feedback, even if it's not what you want to hear, it is a gift. It's something to take in, and it's never a personal reflection of you. And it just, I just think you really need to be patient. And I have so many like young writers in my DMs, like asking like, well, I want to be published. And like, I'm 15, and that's amazing. Like I was like them, but I think if I had been a lot more patient and understood that I would never have wanted the books that I wrote when I was 12 and 13 and 14 to be my debut. So like all of those rejections were amazing, like in hindsight. So I think like just be patient. And if you really love this, you should be able to write 3 different books that will never get published, 5 different books in my case that will never be published, before you write the one that is going to be published, because this is a long game and books take forever. And so if you're not willing to do that, then like, that's fine. Just don't be an author. But I think you should be willing to be patient if you want to be in this industry, because I'm sure like Amy and Jed and like Victor will all tell you, and I will tell you that it takes forever still, even in our position. It's like you're always waiting and you always have to be patient. So it's better to learn that from the beginning.
Amen to all. I'm going to be watching this again to take notes. Thank you so much. This was wonderful. Thanks a million, Amy, Alex, and Jen. Thanks everyone who joined us as well. So Sourcebook has listed the winners in the chat. I'm not going to butcher your name, so check the chat. If you're a winner, you can email Lizzie Lewandowski and claim your prize, and her email's right in the chat box. A million thanks to all of you, and I hope everyone has a fantastic day, and talk soon, hopefully.